The trail disappeared beneath the snow before Ruth Mercer realized she had lost it. One moment, she could see the dark line of pine trees marking the mountain road. The next, everything was white. Ruth pulled her scarf over her mouth and tightened her grip on the reins. Her horse, Jasper, stumbled through the drift. Easy, the wind screamed across the valley. Ruth looked behind her. Nothing. No road. No fence posts. No distant farmhouse. Only snow. She had been traveling home with a sack of flour and a small box of medicine when the blizzard arrived 3 hours early. Now the storm had swallowed the entire mountain pass. Ruth knew she had one chance. Find shelter before nightfall. Ruth had lived alone for 4 years. Her husband, Thomas, had died beneath a falling tree while clearing timber. He had left her a small cabin, 6 acres of rocky pasture, and more determination than money. Ruth had learned to do everything herself. Repair fences, split wood, milk the cow, hunt, preserve meat, patch roofs. She didn't enjoy being alone, but she had become good at surviving it. The mountain had taught her one rule: never challenge winter. Respect it, prepare for it, and if it catches you outside, find shelter. She had planned to reach home before dark, but the storm had changed everything. The wind grew stronger. Jasper stopped repeatedly. Ruth climbed down and walked beside him. Come on, boy. Snow reached her knees, then her waist. She knew the trail had to be somewhere beneath her feet, but she couldn't find it. She checked the compass. The needle trembled. Her hands were already numb. Then Jasper suddenly pulled toward the left. Ruth resisted. No, the trail is that way. The horse refused. He lowered his head and began pawing at the snow. Ruth stared. What are you doing? Jasper pawed again. Something hard appeared beneath the snow. Wood. Ruth crouched. She cleared more snow. A rectangular plank emerged. Then another. She brushed away the snow with both gloves. A wooden hatch appeared beneath her. There was an iron ring in its center. Ruth stared at it. Where did you come from? She pulled. The hatch didn't move. She tried again. Nothing. Then Jasper pawed beside it. Ruth noticed a second iron ring partially buried beneath the snow. She cleared it. The hatch suddenly lifted. A rush of air rose from below. Not cold air. Warm air. Ruth froze. Warmth underground. Impossible. She lowered her lantern. Stone steps disappeared into darkness. Ruth looked at the storm. Then at Jasper. You found us a door. She descended first. The stairs led into a narrow tunnel. The walls were made from rough stone and timber. After 20 feet, the passage opened into a chamber. Ruth stopped breathing for a moment. There was a fireplace, a cast iron stove, wooden bunks, barrels, shelves, a water pump, dry firewood, and food. Dozens of sacks and jars filled the walls. Beans, flour, salt, dried apples, smoked meat, potatoes, candles, blankets. Ruth slowly turned in a circle. Someone had built an entire emergency shelter beneath the valley, and someone had stocked it. Recently, she returned outside. Jasper was still standing in the snow. Ruth led him toward another opening beside the main entrance. A covered passage connected to a small underground stable. There were 2 empty stalls. Fresh hay filled one. Jasper walked inside immediately. Ruth shut the wooden gate, then returned to the shelter. She lit the stove. The fire caught quickly. Warmth spread through the chamber. Ruth removed her gloves. Her fingers burned as circulation returned. She found a kettle, filled it with water, then noticed something carved into the stone wall. A name. Caleb Mercer, 1889. Ruth stared. Mercer. Her own surname. Her husband's family had lived in the valley for generations. Could this have belonged to one of them? She searched the shelves. Behind several flour sacks, she found an old wooden box. Inside was a leather journal. The first page read, "If winter closes the valley, this shelter belongs to whoever reaches it first." Ruth turned the page. More instructions followed. Keep the stove burning. Never waste the water. The western tunnel leads to the creek. The eastern tunnel leads to the high trail. Then one final sentence. If the bell rings, open the doors. Ruth looked toward the ceiling. A bell? She spent the next hour exploring. The shelter was far larger than she'd first realized. There was a storage room, a workshop, a small medical chamber, a second stable, even a room filled with tools. Axes, ropes, snowshoes, lanterns, shovels. Everything someone might need after being trapped by winter. Ruth couldn't understand why such a place had been forgotten. Then she found a map. The valley was covered with markings. Cabins, ranches, mine camps, old trails, emergency routes. At least 6 shelters had once existed. The hidden chamber beneath the valley was the central one. It connected everything. Ruth folded the map carefully. Why did they abandon this? A sound answered her. 3 knocks. Ruth froze. The sound came from somewhere beyond the eastern tunnel. 3 more knocks. She grabbed the lantern. Who's there? Silence. Then a muffled voice. Please. Ruth approached the tunnel entrance. The voice came again. Help me. Ruth hesitated. The journal had warned her about the bell. But not strangers. She picked up an axe, then walked toward the eastern tunnel. At the far end, she found a wooden door buried beneath snow. Someone was trapped outside. Ruth opened it. A young man collapsed through the doorway. She dragged him inside. His coat was frozen solid. His lips were blue. Ruth wrapped him in blankets and pushed him toward the stove. After several minutes, his eyes opened. He stared at her. You found the shelter. Ruth nodded. Who are you? The man looked toward the tunnel, then whispered, Don't light the bell. Ruth frowned. Why? His eyes widened. Because they're following me. Outside, something moved through the snow. Ruth extinguished the lantern. The young man beside the stove whispered, They're close. Ruth tightened her grip on the axe. Who? Men from the old mining camp. He struggled to sit upright. They'd been searching the valley for this shelter. Ruth glanced toward the eastern tunnel. Why? The man looked at the journal on the table. Because your shelter isn't just a shelter. His name was Caleb Mercer. Ruth stared at him. Mercer. He nodded. My grandfather built this place. Ruth looked at the name carved into the stone. Caleb Mercer? My great-grandfather. He explained that the original Caleb Mercer had built the underground refuge after a terrible winter nearly killed an entire settlement. But the shelter had another purpose. It stored emergency supplies and important records for isolated families. Land deeds, mining agreements, property maps, old contracts, everything settlers might need if their homes were destroyed. Then a mining company discovered valuable deposits beneath the valley. They wanted the land. Several families refused to sell. Soon, their records began disappearing. Caleb's great-grandfather hid copies beneath the shelter. The mining company never found them. Until now. Ruth looked toward the tunnel. And those men, they're working for the company. A heavy impact shook the eastern door. Ruth stepped back. Caleb whispered, They found us. Another blow. The wooden door groaned. Ruth looked around the shelter. There had to be another way. She remembered the map. The western tunnel led to the creek. The eastern tunnel was blocked. But the journal mentioned a third passage. She searched the walls. Nothing. Then Jasper began barking from the underground stable. Ruth hurried toward him. The horse was pawing at the floor. She removed a layer of old straw. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor. Ruth pulled it open. A narrow shaft descended into darkness. Caleb stared. That's the old escape tunnel. Where does it go? Under the creek. Ruth smiled. Then we're leaving. They gathered supplies quickly. Medicine, food, blankets, the land records. Ruth put the journal inside her coat. Caleb took a lantern. Then Ruth remembered the bell. If the bell rings, open the doors. She looked toward the old rope hanging from the ceiling. Caleb shook his head. Don't. Ruth pulled the rope. The bell rang. Its deep sound echoed through the entire valley. Caleb stared at her. What are you doing? Calling the people who need this place. Outside, the men stopped. One looked toward the hill. What's that? Another answered. The emergency bell. The first man's expression changed. They're signaling the settlement. They hurried toward the shelter. But they were too late. Across the valley, another bell answered. Then another. Ruth had discovered that the old emergency system was still connected to several abandoned stations. The sound traveled through the mountains. And people heard it. Ruth, Caleb, and Jasper entered the escape tunnel. They crawled beneath the frozen creek. Behind them came the sound of men breaking into the shelter. But the tunnel carried them away. They emerged several hundred yards from the valley. A small group of ranchers was already approaching. They had heard the bells. Ruth shouted, There's someone trapped at the shelter. The ranchers immediately followed her. By sunrise, nearly 20 people had gathered around the hidden entrance. The 3 men were still inside. They realized they were surrounded. After a tense standoff, they surrendered. When the authorities arrived, Caleb showed them the hidden records. The documents proved that the mining company had falsified several property claims. Families who had been told they owned nothing actually possessed legal rights to their land. Ruth's own cabin was among the properties marked for seizure. The investigation lasted months. In the end, the fraudulent claims were canceled. The families kept their land. The mining operation was forced to leave the valley, and the forgotten underground shelter was officially restored. Ruth returned home after the snow melted. Her cabin had survived. The roof needed repairs. The fence was damaged. The garden was buried beneath ice. But it was hers. She rebuilt it. Then she did something else. She began maintaining the shelter. Every autumn, she stocked the shelves, filled the water barrels, stacked firewood, checked the tunnels, repaired the emergency bells. She made sure nobody would ever have to discover it by accident again. Caleb stayed in the valley. Together, they created a volunteer winter rescue network. The old emergency trails were cleared. New signs were installed. The hidden shelters were mapped. And every ranch within 50 miles knew where to go when the mountain roads disappeared. Years later, another terrible blizzard struck. The valley vanished beneath snow. Roads disappeared. Travelers became stranded. But this time, the bells rang before anyone froze. Families followed the marked trails. Ranchers opened their barns. And the underground shelter beneath the valley filled with people. Ruth stood beside the stove while children warmed their hands. She looked toward the old journal. The words written more than a century earlier still remained. This shelter belongs to whoever reaches it first. Ruth had once thought she had found a forgotten room. She eventually understood that she had found something much more valuable. A promise. A promise that no one caught by winter should have to face it alone. Outside, snow buried the valley again. Inside, the fire burned steadily. Jasper slept beside the stove. Caleb handed Ruth a cup of coffee. She smiled. The blizzard could erase roads. It could bury houses. It could hide an entire valley beneath snow. But it couldn't erase a shelter built for those who refused to leave one another behind. And Ruth knew one thing for certain. The next person lost in the storm would find the door waiting.